Welcome to this keynote interview as part of the Diversity and Inclusion stream at this year's Global Borrowers Forum. I'm delighted to be joined today by Joe Keefe, President of the North American division of Impax Asset Management Group. Joe has a long track record in this field, having previously worked as president of a strategic consulting firm specializing in corporate social responsibility, and was a director at US SIP, which represents investors engaged in sustainable investing. Joe, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Richard.
So Impax Investments has for many years now specialized in the field of sustainability as a driver of alpha, as a driver of good asset returns. But we're hearing more and more at our conferences that niche is becoming mainstream. All of the big global asset managers are embracing the concepts you've been championing. How are you going to continue to differentiate yourself?
It's a good question. I think that what's happening as more and more sort of mainstream asset managers enter this space, there are good reasons for that. I think primarily two reasons. First, there's just a lot of research, a lot of data at this point in time suggesting that environmental and social and governance issues have financial materiality. That is to say that they affect the way companies behave and the way investment portfolios behave, and more firms are seeing that evidence. Secondly, I think they're seeing that the public, that investors, that their prospective clients want to invest in companies that are part of the solution rather than part of the problem when it comes to addressing critical global challenges. And so that's where the market is heading. So the data, the research points in that direction. Their potential investors and clients are pointing in that direction, and that's all good. However, we've been doing that work for some time. So we have been integrating ESG data for some time because we understand its materiality. What we do, I think, is still a little bit different. We at Impax really take this transition to a more sustainable economy very, very seriously. We want to understand it. We know that our clients and investors can potentially avail themselves of opportunities that arise because of this transition. We think not understanding it sufficiently can potentially pose some risk. So we basically take a sustainability lens and we apply it to the entire global economy, subsector by subsector, to see where are the potential risks, where are the potential opportunities, where are the potential tailwinds, where are the potential headwinds, and as a result of that analysis, what companies might be winners and what companies may be losers in this transition, which will, have its laggards, but will also have its leaders, and we want to invest in the leaders. That's not simply integrating ESG research. That's really trying to understand and help your clients understand and seize opportunities associated with this transition to a more sustainable economy.
And I know that what you do isn't just asset management. When I'm looking at your website and you talk about your policy and your advocacy work, your thought leadership, engagement with a lot of the companies that you invest in. Do you think that the large generalist asset managers should be doing more of that? Or is that something which is incompatible with their maximizing return brief and best left to companies that are specialists that have been doing that kind of advocacy work for a long time, such as yourself?
I think some of them will, and some of the big mainstream asset managers have begun to do to some extent. One of the reasons I think we do so much thought leadership, one of the reasons we do so much sort of public policy work, so much engagement work, because we see certain themes playing themselves out that are going to be critical to this transition to a more sustainable global economy. They're going to be critical to confronting and addressing global challenges. So for example, climate. We've been sort of specialist investors in climate solutions and environmental solutions for some time, and we think a lot about it. And because we think a lot about it, we write a lot about it. We create a lot of thought leadership about it. We launch strategies that focus on it. We've done the same, when it comes to gender equality, particularly in the United States, where we saw early on that there were potential advantages associated with companies being at the table to address one of our most pressing global problems, that is gender inequality, which arguably could be considered the #1 human rights issue across the globe. And all kinds of studies have showed that holding literally 1/2 of the world's population back through unequal pay, discrimination, and so forth, really cost the global economy a lot. So we saw opportunities there. And so we started thinking about that too. We started writing about it, creating thought leadership. We are now active in the public policy front. We've proposed, we filed petitions for rulemaking with the Securities and Exchange Commission in the United States on gender and racial equality issues, on climate issues, because we think there's more work to be done to press markets to move forward and to press companies to move forward. And so we end up doing a lot of engagement, a lot of thought leadership, a lot of public policy work. We think that's a critical part of being a full-fledged sustainable asset manager.
Right. And I guess that greater focus makes you much more able to do that in a more effective way. I can see that. On that subject, you mentioned there about climate change. I mean, climate and I suppose all of these topics basically have had to compete with COVID in the last year. COVID has been getting everyone's attention. It's been the main topic of conversation at most of the conferences and whatever. Now, let's hope and pray that COVID is close to the end of its effects. I've asked quite a few people the same question. I've got very different answers. What do you think the long-term effects of the pandemic and the attention that it's got going to be on attitudes amongst the public towards climate investment?
It's interesting. I think COVID has laid bare some of our shortcomings, to say the least, but it has also accelerated some changes, some societal changes that potentially can help us seize the opportunities before us. There's no doubt that the tragedy of the pandemic was profound, but we learned a lot of lessons from it. We saw how it plays out in business organizations. We saw how it particularly created issues for women and women of color, certain employees that had a more difficult time with the remote work environment, because when they're working remotely, they had a lot of childcare issues at the same time. It laid bare some of the sort of inequities, in the corporate sector, and it also really sort of sensitized us to public health in its broad ramifications being something that companies have to focus on, that public health is their employees' health, that public health is their customers' health, that public health affects the health of their supply chain. And all of that was sort of laid bare during the pandemic, such that, addressing climate issues, which can become serious public health issues, with additional warming and floods and droughts and so forth, becomes more prominent, I think, in the sort of thinking and the business strategies of corporations. I actually think that the post-COVID environment will be one that's not only more sensitized to sort of workplace health and safety issues, but one that is more sensitized to global health issues more broadly, including health issues associated with climate and the dislocations that climate can potentially bring. So, for example, one thing we're seeing, companies are beginning to realize that they are all really subject to physical risk associated with climate. We know certain industries like energy and so forth face real transition risks, but all industries potentially can be affected by the physical risk associated with rising seas and global storm surges and wildfires and drought and so forth. So I think companies are now seeing climate as a business exigency. It's a business necessity. And I think the year and a half we spent with COVID has sort of accelerated that sort of sensitization process, if you will. And I think we'll come out the other side of COVID more attuned to some of the risks that companies face than we were going in.
I can see that. I can see a lot of the effects on things like the value of real estate and whatever has fundamentally changed.
Precisely.
In the way that it will potentially do with climate changes.
Absolutely.
Yeah. As an asset manager, I know you spend a lot of time talking about sustainability, transition, gender, as investment factors, as drivers of return. But unlike any asset manager, you don't spend a huge amount of time talking about equity or fixed income, 60-40, all that kind of thing. As an investor, if you accept your hypothesis that these factors are important, and increasingly people are accepting that they're drivers of return, which asset class is better suited to implement that view that you have Is it equity? Is it fixed income? Is it other?
It's an interesting question, Richard. So as you know, in the ESG space, broadly speaking, sustainable investing arena, I think ESG first took hold on the equity side for the most part. I think fixed income was sort of later to the dance, if you will. And so there's reasons for that. When you're invested in a company, you're an owner of that company. And when you buy fixed income securities, you're loaning money to that company. It's a slightly different relationship, the relationship between sort of ownership and lender. That said, we're starting to see now a real pickup on the fixed income side in companies integrating ESG factors into company corporate credit analysis and so forth. We also, in our fixed income strategies, we apply the same sustainability lens. And if you spoke to our fixed income portfolio managers, right now we're currently managing an investment grade bond strategy and a high yield bond strategy. They will tell you that looking at the economy through that sustainability lens, understanding where the risks are and the opportunities are associated with this transition, subsector by subsector, again, because they play out very differently in different subsectors, is helpful to them designing a portfolio that as a whole has a healthy tilt toward subsectors and toward companies that are more likely to be winners in this transition and less likely to be laggards and to face challenges. So I think it's going to play out on the fixed income side. I do not think at the present time there is an asset class that's necessarily more built for sustainability than others. I think you'll see it play out in small cap and large cap, fixed income and high yield. There are obviously certain sectors in certain regions right now where there might be less ESG data. There might be a paucity of ESG data that are perhaps less transparent. In developed market, large cap companies in developed markets, you basically know almost everything about them. They're pretty well covered. They really live under the Klieg lights, and they're pretty transparent. Whereas smaller companies in emerging markets, there's probably less ESG data at the moment. That will play itself out in terms of certain asset classes and whether they're more or less, when it comes to ESG, more or less viable as sort of strategy. That said, we're starting to see ESG research now across the globe, across regions, across sectors. And so I think it's becoming less and less of an issue. And you're starting to see this discussion in the US now. Europe is a little ahead of the US. You're starting to see a real movement for standardized disclosure of ESG information, which is going to facilitate sustainable investing in ultimately probably in most, if not all, asset classes.
Yeah, I know that here in the UK, gender pay discrepancy report came in a few years ago is a significant driver of change.
Absolutely.
I can see that. But actually, it kind of brings me on to my final question, which is about applying the gender lens to investments. And if there is an empirical correlation between the performance of a company and a gender diversity metric, it kind of begs a couple of questions. One is, how do you actually measure that? How do you measure gender diversity? Carbon dioxide emissions, that's really easy to measure. What are you measuring when you're measuring gender diversity? And sort of related question to that, I guess, is, are you sure about a causal relationship? Could it be instead that there's a correlation between, I don't know, the different sectors that are involved or the different parts of the cycle?
So it's a great question. In terms of gender metrics, there are a lot of them. And no one metric stands out as sort of the be-all, end-all in terms of proving causation or resulting in better corporate performance. But we strongly believe, and we have substantial evidence of that over the years, not only sort of in the body of research that's out there now, but also in the performance of our own portfolios, and in particular our global women's leadership portfolio, that over time, companies that have better, more diverse teams perform better. Now, we obviously look at a few factors that can be quantified: the percentage of the women on a company's board, the percentage of women in senior management, and then a percentage of women in key leadership positions such as CFO or CEO or on the senior management committee and so forth. departmental heads, all of those things are relevant. There's not only research at this point in time suggesting that companies with more diverse leadership teams, and particularly on the issue of gender diversity, perform better, but there's also research suggesting that companies with women in more senior management positions in particular also do better on confronting other challenges they face. Companies with more women in management seem to be doing a better job on climate. Companies with more women in management seem to be doing a better job on diversity and inclusion and equality more broadly, in terms of hiring diverse teams, in terms of promoting diverse candidates, in terms of better benefits, better work-life balance. So companies with more diverse leadership teams are seeing the benefits in a lot of different areas. Not all of that at the moment is exactly quantifiable, and the fact that you could give one company a 6.4 rating and the company next to it a 5.9 rating. But increasingly, again, there's going to be more disclosure. Increasingly, again, that disclosure is going to be more sort of uniform and comparable across companies, across markets. So increasingly, again, I think we're going to get better and better at sort of quantifying the advantages. Whether it's causal or correlative, it will always be in play, and sometimes correlation is enough. PE ratio isn't always causative, but investors look at PE ratio to see whether or not, because it can be relevant. Not all gender factors are always material, are always relevant at all points in time for every single company. But that's also true of any financial factor historically. So we think this data is really important. We think companies that embrace diversity are just better built, they're more resilient. Companies that have more diverse leadership teams seem to have done better during the pandemic. So we're confident that over time, the diversity case, if you will, the business case for diversity is going to continue to play out.
I can see that as an asset manager, perhaps the causation isn't as important as the fact, yep, the correlation is there. That's good enough to trade on.
Right,
exactly. And I particularly like your point about metrics taking into account the quality, top management roles, the days where perhaps the lower paid board directors or the HR or whatever would be, don't say tokenist. The fact that actually getting more senior positions, more decision-making positions is relevant.
And on that, it's interesting. You asked the question about COVID, Richard. I think one of the learnings, if you will, that's coming out of the pandemic is that these issues, equality, diversity, inclusion, these EDI issues aren't just for HR anymore. Really, the leadership broadly within a company has to attend to them, and the company will do better if the leadership embraces that. You will do better with a more diverse workforce. You'll do better. So I think, again, I don't want to sound Pollyannish, but I do think the learning we took from the pandemic, I think coming out the other side will be stronger because we'll have better information about what made companies more resilient and what didn't, and that will be helpful.
It's like the point we started about, that this as an investment driver is no longer a niche. It's part of become mainstream, and these factors are not just an HR factor, but part of everyday decisions.
That's right, exactly. They're strategic, absolutely.
Which is an extremely positive note to end it on. Joe Keefe, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me. It was great talking to you.